Good day to each and everyone. Today, we will discuss the electoral and party politics during the martial law period. Let's start with the introduction. Throughout much of the post-World War II period from 1946 to 1972, the Philippine party system had achieved some measure of consistency, with two parties alternating for control of government under the operating rules established in the 1935 Constitution. The liberals and nacionalistas were able to alternate in power. The declaration of martial law on September 21, 1972, abruptly ended all forms of open party and electoral contestation, at least for the next 5 years. Congress was not allowed to convene while scores of opposition members were arrested. The beginning of martial rule represented an end in the country's long experiment with Western-style democracy. Marcos and martial law dismantled the superstructure of constitutional government that had been transplanted to the Philippines under American colonial rule. In its place was established a new society that was to eventually become the foundation for constitutional authoritarianism, which was the essential rationalization for martial rule. During the first 5 years of martial rule, political decisions were made largely by executive fiat sanctified by popular referendum. All were virtually unsupervised by the Commission on Elections. Comlecon served the purpose of legalizing one-man rule. In January 1973, Marcos called for a special referendum to ratify the 1973 Constitution through the convening of so-called citizen assemblies. The creation of such assemblies served as alternatives to traditional decision-making, especially in the absence of a Congress. This particular referendum was unique in that it allowed only for a superficial acclamation. According to Marcos' allies, the referendum by citizen assemblies was resorted to because the enemies of the state were taking advantage of the debate over the draft constitution to foment anxiety, confusion, discord, and subversion. Shortly after that first referendum, the president issued Proclamation 1102 claiming that 95% of the people in these assemblies are in favor of the 1973 Constitution, while the same percentage indicated that there was no need to hold a separate plebiscite on the same Constitution. What this referendum has accomplished is to effectively displace the formal institutions of determining popular consent by way of secret balloting. Essentially, Marcos would not get too many dissenting votes given the manner in which they were cast in these citizen assemblies, i.e., the open raising of hands. On July 20, 1973, fresh from a controlled popular mandate, Marcos held another referendum intended to respond to the issue of his term extension. The question in the referendum was whether or not the people wanted Marcos to continue serving as president beyond 1973 and finish the reforms he has initiated under martial law. The obvious results of the referendum showed that 90% of the voters wanted Marcos to extend his term as president beyond what was provided for in the 1935 Constitution and effectively putting an end to presidential term limits. By the beginning of the second half of the 1970s, there was growing concern about where martial rule was taking the country and for how long. A fourth referendum on October 16, 1976, sought to answer this question regarding the continuation of martial rule. This political exercise was intended to consolidate the state's martial law powers and the president in the personification of Marcos. Under Marcos and martial rule, elections have taken on a new meaning, especially for the incumbent. Indeed, the Marcos regime had mocked the concept of election more than any government since Quirino's in 1949. 32, the popular vote and electoral process have both been subverted by Marcos. Franco cites some changes that were made in election procedures during the martial law period that were designed to hinder independent opposition candidates and machines the controversial block voting system that had been used in a few previous elections to make incumbent cheating easier was reinstituted. The first elections under martial rule were held on April 7, 1978, for members of the Interim National Assembly. Just before the elections, the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan or KBLU New Society movement was established as an umbrella organization of politicians supporting Marcos and his new society, ideology, and fielded candidates in the region-based elections. The KBL candidates in metropolitan Manila was led by none other than the First Lady, Imelda Marcos. While many opposition political groups, including the Liberal Party, called for a boycott of the elections, a number of them organized under a new opposition group in metropolitan Manila. the Lakas NG Bayan or People's Power Alignwa, that contested the elections led by former senator and jailed oppositionist Benigno Aquino. Aquino, despite being a member of the Liberal Party, ran for a seat in Manila from his jail cell. While Aquino and other prominent opposition personalities participated in the 1978 electoral exercise, many more actually boycotted the polls. The election of 1978 was clearly a strategy on the part of Marcos to further legitimize the state under martial law. On the one hand, the strategy proved to be successful in paving the way for more aid to the regime. One rift of particular significance was that between the Laurel family and Marcos. Salvador Laurel, a prominent scion of the political family, was once a Marcos supporter, but later turned opposition, presumably as a response to the attempt of the president to undermine his political stature in his region during the 1978 elections. In 1979, Laurel revived the Nacionalista Party and began to challenge the KBL in Batangas during the 1980 local elections. Hutchcroft and Rocamora observed that the KBL was not created in the same mold as the traditional parties that dominated much of the country's pre-martial law electoral and party politics. The KBL achieved a centralized control of government resources, a major source of patronage, to a far greater extent than any Philippine president since Manuel Quezon and his Nacionalista Party in the 1930s. For this reason, local officials especially became very eager to join the ruling party. This invariably tilted the balance of power in favor of the national over the local, even those that were inherently clan-based. However, at the national level, it was especially difficult to distinguish between the structures of the ruling party and the crony abuses that defined the essential character of the Marcos regime. By the mid-1970s, practically all the parties that existed prior to the declaration of martial law were immobilized. In order to put up a semblance of electoral legitimacy, Marcos created KBL that brought together Marcos's national and local allies with former members of the opposition who chose to join him rather than retire. It was strongly pro-government and was the only party allowed to prevail in all the electoral exercises conducted throughout the period of martial rule.
Good day everyone, my name is Curly Boy. And now we will continue the report. And our topic is the anti-Marcos opposition. Perhaps, learning from their experience in the two previous elections, the Laurel faction of the Nacionalistas, along with other members of the elite pre-martial law and anti-Marcos opposition, established the United Nationalist Democratic Opposition, or UNIDO, in August 1980. Ang kaning UNIDO gituohan nga gigamit aron muupo sa pagdumala ni President Ferdinand Marcos, which is nag-establish og martial law atong 1972. So ang gitinguha aning UNIDO is matagaan og balik og demokrasiya ang Pilipinas. And next is the extra-legal opposition. Aside from indirectly giving birth to UNIDO, the 1980 elections lead the opposition to conceive of an alternative strategy of launching an urban insurrection in Manila that would eventually snowball into a popular uprising against Marcos. So, ilang gipakita ilang katungod og ang pag-against nila sa pagdumala ni Marcos. So, kini na strategy gipasalida or ilang gipagawas aron makabot nila ang kalampusan sa pagpukaw sa katawhang masa ug para naay kausaban ang gobyerno. As a result, two urban insurrectionary campaigns were launched in 1979 and late 1980. Mainly in the form of bombing specific targets and intended to break the regime's facade of stability. To a certain extent, the insurrectionary campaigns convinced Marcos to create an environment and semblance of stability and normalcy. Part of the normalization strategy was the lifting of martial law in 1981, January. However, in lifting martial law, Marcos made it clear that he was not about to give up his dictatorial powers. Under the transitory and amended provisions of the 1973 Constitution, popular criticism against Marcos continued. So ang insurrectionary campaigns is gi-convince nila si Marcos to stop the martial law. So pero giklaro ni Marcos na dili siya pwede diktahan ug wala niya gisuko ang iyahang dictatorial power. Next, the first martial rule presidency. In March 1981, Marcos called for another referendum. This was clearly a prelude for the first presidential elections since the declaration of martial law. Marcos held the referendum that actually instituted another amendment in the Constitution requiring a presidential candidate to be at least 50 years old. These requirements effectively prevented Benigno Aquino, who would have been under 50 years of age at the time, from running as a candidate in the June 16, 1981 presidential elections. Marcos held the referendum nga naghatag og resulta sa usa ka dugang na amendment sa Constitution na ang kandidato sa pagka-presidente is nangidaron at least 50 years old. So kanina balaod is nahimong epektibo nga nagpugong kang Benigno Aquino sa pag-apil isip kandidato sa eleksyon sa umaabot na eleksyon June 16, 1981. So sa kanina rason, klaro na kaayo na dapat mo tigbabaw gyapon ang gahom ni Marcos. The group's aim to boycott any plebiscite of election called by the administration was effective to the point that Marcos was forced to put up his own opponent, a political non-entity named Alejo Santos, whom people barely remember today. So kay napungan man ang pagdaga ni Benigno Aquino, so wala na atbang si Marcos. So nabalaka ang katawhan, gi-force nila si Marcos na dapat naa siya ka atbang. So giatbangan siya ni Alejo Santos. Si Alejo Santos is baguhan pa lang ni siya sa politika, dili pa gyud siya ilado sa katawhan. So June 16, 1981 nahitabo ang first election for president. Ang ningdaog is si Marcos, nakakuha siya og 88% of the votes and was proclaimed president for a 6 years term. Next, consolidation of anti-Marcos opposition. August 21, 1983, Benigno Aquino Jr., the only viable legal opposition and alternative to Marcos, was assassinated as he was escorted out of a commercial airline flight from the United States. This political incident led to the consolidation and strengthening of the opposition against Marcos, given that he was the prime suspect in the assassination. What came out of this consolidation effort was a unique kind of opposition, which, while not monolithic, distinguished itself from the traditional political parties that had long dominated the Philippine political scene. The unity of the opposition was put to the test during the May 14, 1984 elections for members of the now regular National Assembly. There were those opposed to Marcos who favored the continuation of the boycott against the regime's initiatives to legitimize itself by means of the ballot. Ang mga anti-Marcos is naghisgot og proseso og naningkamot sila sa pagtipon og pakighiusa sa mga grupo, individual or sector nga nag-ila og oposisyon batok sa liderato ni Marcos. So mao ni ang paagi sa paghimo og mas lig-on na puwersa o hanay sa mga tao nga kontra sa pagdaga ni Marcos. So, ang consolidation of anti-Marcos opposition is nagresulta sa mas kusog nga puwersa sa opposition sa nasod. Ang kini na klase sa opposition is gipangunahan sa compact o sa kaalyansa naghihimo atong January 1984 og gilangkuban sa bag-ong nabuo nga kilusan sa kapangyarihan at karapatan ng bayan or kaakbay or the movement for the sovereignty and rights of the people, the Liberal Party, the Filipino Democratic Party or PDP, and the Nationalist Alliance. Natay 6 conditions for Marcos to meet in order for the opposition to participate in the May 1984 political exercise. First, ang repeal of the constitutional amendment giving Marcos legislative powers similar to those of the Batasan. So, kini mo ang pagbuwag sa constitutional amendment nga naghatag kang Marcos og legislative power pinaagi sa legal nga proseso. Number 2 is repeal of the various draconian decrees which allowed Marcos to detain critics and deprive political offenders of basic citizenship rights. So, ibasura ang mga draconian decrees. Kung moingon ta og draconian meaning harsh na pagdala. So, ibasura tong mga harsh na pamaagi na iral ni Marcos na naghatag sa iyaha og power to detain critics. Kini nagdala og mga positibong pagbag-o sa nasod kung diin ang karapatan o kalayaan sa mga mamamayan is nibalik. So it means ang mga hindi makatarungan na patakaran ni Marcos is natanggal. Ang ikatulo is passage of amendment requiring a 2/3 vote of the batasan before martial law could be declared. So, sa pag-approve sa amendment is nanginahanglan og 2/3 vote gikan sa batasan. So, nagpasabot nga dili sayon og ang pagdeklara og martial law og kinahanglan og dakong porsyento sa mga miyembro sa batasan ang suporta ani. Number 4 is passage of an amendment requiring batasan confirmation for top government appointment. So, ang pagbag-o sa balaod is nagkinahanglan karon o aprobahan gikan sa batasan. Ang ikalima is amnesty and release of all political prisoners. So, gitugutan na ang mga political prisoner na napreso tungod sa ilang mga panag-away or sa krimen na ilang gihimo, giatagan sila og kapahulayan o makasalig sila sa ilahang kaluwasan sulod sa prisuhan. Then ang last, number 6 is implementation of specific electoral procedural reforms including opposition, accreditation, a ban on the presence of state security forces at the polling centers, appointment of independents to the COMELEC, registration of voters, and guaranteed equal access to the media. So, pagpatuman sa mga konkretong pagbago sa proseso sa election. So, kabilang niini ang paghatag og pagtugot sa opposition na mahimong opisyal na kalahok, pagbawal sa pagkakaroon ng mga puwersa ng seguridad ng estado sa mga lugar ng botohan, pag-appoint og mga tao nga independente sa COMELEC, pagrehistro og usab sa mga botante og garantisado na parehas ang pag-access sa mga media. So kanin na layunin is para ma-maintain ang katarungan at integridad sa proseso sa eleksyon. So Marcos responded only partially to these demands, anticipating the continued divisions among the ranks of the opposition. So as a result, ang Unido decided to participate while the Liberal Party was split and some members of Compil. So the position of those who choose to participate in May 14, 1984, elections for member of the National Assembly was bolstered with the revival of Nomvril. led by Jose Concepcion Jr., for purposes of protecting the votes for the anti-Marcos opposition. So, NAMFREL became the accredited election watchdog both in the May 1984 and February 1986 elections. Next, the personification of the opposition. November 1984, a facilitator group composed of former University of the Philippines President Emmanuel Soriano, Alfredo Bingzon, Ricardo Lupa, Joaquin Bernas, and Ramon del Rosario Jr. convened a few prominent individuals, or also known as the convener group, who were perceived as political neutral, to put together a list of candidates that would be the opposition's answer to Marcos. The convener group was able to identify 12 potential standard bearers who could possibly be fielded as presidential and vice presidential candidates against Marcos. So, among the 12 were Agapito Aquino, Jose Ducno, Teofesto Gingona, Eva Calao, Salvador Laurel, Raul Manglapuz, Aquilino Pimentel, and Jovito Salonga. So, August 1985, according to Warfel, na anak daw si Marcos nga mudagan og usab. So, ang convener group had also seriously entertained the idea of Corazon Aquino running against Marcos. So, November 1985, Marcos finally announced that he would submit himself to another election by February 7, 1986. However, as early as October 1985, Corazon Aquino was not still convinced to run unless dili siya makakuha og 1 million signatures nga mo support sa iyang candidacy. So si Joaquin Roses, usa ka publisher, nag-launch siya campaign para makakollect siya signatures para makonvince si Corazon na atbangan si Marcos. So, ang nahitabo is duha na hinuon kabuok ang ning atbang ni Marcos, si Corazon and si Salvador Laurel. So, February 7, 1986, the presidential elections. So, ang NAMFRELs, sila man to ang watchdog. So, gisecure nila na dili makadaya si Marcos. But, Marcos redoubled his effort para ma-manipulate niya ang boto ug ang resulta. So, 2 days after the polls closed, 30 computer operators staged a protest walkout at COMELEC headquarters, taking computer desks and printouts with them and charging that the official vote count was being manipulated. This stunning indictment of the official count was followed by a massive civil disobedience campaign called by Corazon Aquino and endorsed by the Catholic bishop. A few days later, on February 21, a section of military led by Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos defected to the side of the Democratic opposition. After 4 tense days, the Marcoses, along with their closest associates, were airlifted to the Clark Air Base in U.S. helicopters en route to exile in Hawaii. So, the EDSA People Power Revolution had succeeded in removing Marcos. And last is the electoral politics under martial law. Pre-martial law, political parties had become emasculated in the absence of open electoral contest, which they would normally dominate. The monopoly of power by Marcos made sure that traditional parties remained weak throughout that period. Sa electoral politics under martial law is daghan og nausab sa election o proseso sa politika. ginapugngan ang katungod sa katawhan. So walay freedom of speech ang katawhan para magpadayag sa ilahang mga opinyon. And then ginakontrol sad ang media, ang mga militar o mga otoridad sa gobyerno ang nagkontrol sa media para limit lang ang impormasyon na mugawas. Pati sad gani ang mga partido sa politika, ginabawalan sila, ginapugngan sa ilahang mga kalihukan. Kay kung supakon nila ang mga otoridad sa gobyerno, gamitan sila og puwersa o pwede sila tanggalon og dili pasudlon sa politika. So mo na siya under sa electoral politics under martial law. And that's all our report. Thank you for listening, everyone. God bless.